Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Part 2, Abandoned. Chapter 1. It was now exactly 7 months since the balloon voyagers had been thrown on Lincoln Island. During that time, notwithstanding the researches they had made, no human being had been discovered. No smoke even had betrayed the presence of man on the surface of the island. No vestiges of his handiwork showed that either at an early or a late period had man lived there. Not only did it now appear to be uninhabited by any but themselves, but the colonists were compelled to believe that it had never been inhabited. And now all this scaffolding of reasonings fell before a simple ball of metal found in the body of an inoffensive rodent. In fact, this bullet must have issued from a firearm, and who but a human being could have used such a weapon? When Pencroft had placed the bullet on the table, his companions looked at it with intense astonishment. All the consequences likely to result from this incident, notwithstanding its apparent insignificance, immediately took possession of their minds. The sudden apparition of a supernatural being could not have startled them more completely. Cyrus Harding did not hesitate to give utterance to the suggestions which this fact, at once surprising and unexpected, could not fail to raise in his mind. He took the bullet, turned it over and over, rolled it between his finger and thumb, then, turning to Pencroft, he asked, "Are you sure that the peccary wounded by this bullet was not more than 3 months old?" "Not more, Captain," replied Pencroft. "It was still suckling its mother when I found it in the trap." "Well," said the engineer, "that proves that within 3 months a gunshot was fired in Lincoln Island." "And that a bullet," added Gideon Spilett, "wounded, though not mortally, this little animal." "That is unquestionable," said Cyrus Harding, "and these are the deductions which must be drawn from this incident, that the island was inhabited before our arrival, or that men have landed here within 3 months. Did these men arrive here voluntarily or involuntarily, by disembarking on the shore or by being wrecked? This point can only be cleared up later. As to what they were, Europeans or Malays, enemies or friends of our race, we cannot possibly guess, and if they still inhabit the island, or if they have left it, we know not. But these questions are of too much importance to be allowed to remain long unsettled." "No, 100 times no!" cried the sailor, springing up from the table. "There are no other men than ourselves on Lincoln Island, by my faith. The island isn't large, and if it had been inhabited, we should have seen some of the inhabitants long before this. In fact, the contrary would be very astonishing," said Herbert. "But it would be much more astonishing, I should think," observed the reporter, "if this peccary had been born with a bullet in its inside." "At least," said Neb seriously, "if Pencroft has not had—" "Look here, Neb," burst out Pencroft, "do you think I could have a bullet in my jaw for 5 or 6 months without finding it out? Where could it be hidden?" he asked, opening his mouth to show the 32 teeth with which it was furnished. "Look well, Neb, and if you find one hollow tooth in this set, I will let you pull out half a dozen." "Neb's supposition is certainly inadmissible," replied Harding, who, notwithstanding the gravity of his thoughts, could not restrain a smile. "It is certain that a gun has been fired in the island, within 3 months at most, but I'm inclined to think that the people who landed on this coast were only here for a very short time ago, or that they just touched here, for if when we surveyed the island from the summit of Mount Franklin it had been inhabited, we should have seen them, or we should have been seen ourselves, It is therefore probable that within only a few weeks castaways have been thrown by a storm on some part of the coast. However that may be, it is of consequence to us to have this point settled. I think that we should act with caution, said the reporter. Such is my advice, replied Cyrus Harding, for it is to be feared that Malay pirates have landed on the island. Captain, asked the sailor, would it not be a good plan, before setting out, to build a canoe in which we could either ascend the river or, if we liked, coast round the inland? It will not do to be unprovided. Your idea is good, Pencroft, replied the engineer, but we cannot wait for that. It would take at least a month to build a boat. Yes, a real boat, replied the sailor, but we do not want one for a sea voyage, and in 5 days at the most, I will undertake to construct a canoe fit to navigate the Mersey. 5 days? Cried Neb. To build a boat? Yes, Neb, a boat in the Indian fashion. Of wood? Asked the negro, looking still unconvinced. Of wood, replied Pencroft, or rather of bark. I repeat, Captain, that in 5 days the work will be finished. In 5 days, then, be it, replied the engineer. But till that time we must be very watchful, said Herbert. Very watchful indeed, my friends, replied Harding, and I beg you to confine your hunting excursions to the neighborhood of Granite House. The dinner ended less gaily than Pencroft had hoped. So then the island was, or had been, inhabited by others than the settlers. Proved as it was by the incident of the bullet, it was hereafter an unquestionable act, and such a discovery could not but cause great uneasiness among the colonists. Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett, before sleeping, conversed long about the matter. They asked themselves if by chance this incident might not have some connection with the inexplicable way in which the engineer had been saved, and the other peculiar circumstances which had struck them at different times. However, Cyrus Harding, after having discussed the pros and cons of the question, ended by saying, "In short, would you like to know my opinion, my dear Spilett?" "Yes, Cyrus." "Well, then, it is this. However minutely we explore the island, we shall find nothing." The next day Pencroft set to work. He did not mean to build a boat with boards and planking, but simply a flat-bottomed canoe, which would be well suited for navigating the Mersey, above all for approaching its source where the water would naturally be shallow. Pieces of bark, fastened one to the other, would form a light boat, and in case of natural obstacles which would render a portage necessary, it would be easily carried. Pencroft intended to secure the pieces of bark by means of nails to ensure the canoe being watertight. It was first necessary to select the trees which would afford a strong and supple bark for the work. Now the last storm had brought down a large number of birch trees, the bark of which would be perfectly suited for their purpose. Some of these trees lay on the ground, and they had only to be barked, which was the most difficult thing of all, owing to the imperfect tools which the settlers possessed. However, they overcame all difficulties. While the sailor, seconded by the engineer, thus occupied himself without losing an hour, Gideon Spilett and Herbert were not idle. They were made purveyors to the colony. The reporter could not but admire the boy, who had acquired great skill in handling the bow and spear. Herbert also showed great courage, and much of that presence of mind which may be justly called the reasoning of bravery. These two companions of the chase, remembering Cyrus Harding's recommendations, did not go beyond a radius of 2 miles around Granite House, but the borders of the forest furnished a sufficient tribute to agouti, capybara, kangaroo, peccary, and if the result from the traps was less than during the cold, still the warren yielded its accustomed quota, which might have fed all the colony in Lincoln Island. Often during these excursions, Herbert talked with Gideon Spilett on the incident of the bullet and the deductions which the engineer drew from it. And one day, it was the 26th of October, he said, "But Mr. Spilett, do you not think it very extraordinary that if any castaways have landed on the island, they have not yet shown themselves near Granite House?" "Very astonishing if they're still here," replied the reporter, "but not astonishing at all if they're here no longer." So you think that these people have already quitted the island? Returned Herbert. It's more than probable, my boy. For if their stay was prolonged, above all, if they were still here, some accident would have at last betrayed their presence. But if they were able to go away, observed the lad, they could not have been castaways. No, Herbert, or at least they were what we would call provisional castaways. It's very possible that a storm may have driven them to the island without destroying their vessel, and that the storm over, they went away again. I must acknowledge one thing, said Herbert. It is that Captain Harding appears rather to fear than desire the presence of human beings on our island. In short, responded the reporter, there are only Malays who frequent these seas, and those fellows are ruffians, which it is best to avoid. It is not impossible, Mr. Spilett, said Herbert, that someday or other we may find traces of their landing. I do not say no, my boy. A deserted camp, the ashes of a fire, would put us on the track, and this is what we will look for in our next expedition. The day on which the hunters spoke thus, they were in a part of the forest near the Mersey, remarkable for its beautiful trees. There, among others, rose to a height of nearly 200 feet above the ground some of those superb coniferae to which, in New Zealand, the natives give the name of kauri. I have an idea, Mr. Spilett, said Herbert. If I were to climb to the top of one of these kauri, I could survey the country for an immense distance round. The idea is good, replied the reporter. But could you climb to the top of those giants? I can at least try, replied Herbert. The light and active boy then sprang on the first branches, the arrangement of which made the ascent of the kauri easy, and in a few minutes he arrived at the summit, which emerged from the immense plain of verdure. From this elevated situation his gaze extended over all the southern portion of the island, from Cape Claw on the southeast to Reptile End on the southwest. To the northwest rose Mount Franklin, which concealed a great part of the horizon. But Herbert, from the height of his observatory, could examine all the yet unknown portion of the island, which might have given shelter to the strangers whose presence they suspected. The lad looked attentively. There was nothing in sight on the sea, not a sail, neither on the horizon nor near the island. However, as the bank of trees hid the shore, it was possible that a vessel, especially if deprived of her masts, might lie close to the land and thus be invisible to Herbert. Neither in the forest of the far west was anything to be seen. The wood formed an impenetrable screen, measuring several square miles, without a break or an opening. It was impossible even to follow the course of the Mersey, or to ascertain in what part of the mountain it took its source. Perhaps other creeks also ran towards the west, but they could not be seen. But at last, if all indication of an encampment escaped Herbert's sight, could he not even catch a glimpse of smoke, the faintest trace of which would be easily discernible in the pure atmosphere? For an instant, Herbert thought he could perceive a light smoke in the west, but a more attentive examination showed that he was mistaken. He strained his eyes in every direction, and his sight was excellent. No, decidedly, there was nothing there. Herbert descended to the foot of the kauri, and the two sportsmen returned to Granite House. There Cyrus Harding listened to the lad's account, shook his head, and said nothing. It was very evident that no decided opinion could be pronounced on this question until after a complete exploration of the island. 2 days after, the 28th of October, another incident occurred, for which an explanation was again required. While strolling along the shore about 2 miles from Granite House, Herbert and Neb were fortunate enough to capture a magnificent specimen of the order of Chelonia. It was a turtle of the species Midas, the edible green turtle, so called from the color both of its shell and fat. Herbert caught sight of this turtle as it was crawling among the rocks to reach the sea. "Help, Neb, help!" he cried. Neb ran up. "What a fine animal," said Neb. "But how are we to catch it?" "Nothing is easier, Neb," replied Herbert. "We have only to turn the turtle on its back, and it cannot possibly get away. Take your spear and do as I do." The reptile, aware of danger, had retired between its carapace and plastron. They no longer saw its head or feet, and it was motionless as a rock. Herbert and Neb then drove their sticks underneath the animal, and by their united efforts managed without difficulty to turn it on its back. The turtle, which was 3 feet in length, would have weighed at least 400 pounds. "Capital!" cried Neb. "This is something which will rejoice friend Pencroft's heart." In fact, the heart of friend Pencroft could not fail to be rejoiced, for the flesh of the turtle, which feeds upon rack grass, is extremely savory. At this moment the creature's head could be seen, which was small, flat, but widened behind by the large temporal foci hidden under the long roof. "And now, what shall we do with our prize?" said Neb. "We can't drag it to Granite House." "Leave it here, since it cannot turn over," replied Herbert, "and we will come back with the cart to fetch it." "That is the best plan." However, for greater precaution, Herbert took the trouble, which Neb deemed superfluous, to wedge up the animal with great stones, after which the 2 hunters returned to Granite House, following the beach, which the tide had left uncovered. Herbert, wishing to surprise Pencroft, said nothing about the superb specimen of a chelonian, which they had turned over on the sand. But 2 hours later, he and Neb returned with the cart to the place where they had left it. The superb specimen of a chelonian was no longer there. Neb and Herbert stared at each other at first. Then they stared about them. It was just at this spot that the turtle had been left. The lad even found the stones which he had used, and therefore he was certain of not being mistaken. "Well," said Neb, "these beasts can turn themselves over then." "It appears so," replied Herbert, who could not understand it at all, and was gazing at the stones scattered on the sand. "Well, Pencroft will be disgusted, and Captain Harding will perhaps be very perplexed how to explain his disappearance." "Look here," said Neb, who wished to hide his ill luck, "we won't speak about it." "On the contrary, Neb, we must speak about it." And the two, taking the cart, which there was now no use for, returned to Granite House. Arrived at the dockyard where the engineer and the sailor were working together, Herbert recounted what had happened. "Oh, the stupids!" cried the sailor. "To have at least 50 meals escape!" "But Pencroft," replied Neb, "it wasn't our fault that the beast got away, as I tell you. We had turned it over on its back." "Then you didn't turn it over far enough," returned the obstinate sailor. "Not enough." And he told how he had taken care to wedge up the turtle with stones. "It was a miracle, then," replied Pencroft. "I thought, Captain," said Herbert, "the turtles, once placed on their backs, could not regain their feet, especially when they are of large size." "That is true, my boy. And?" "Then how did it manage?" "At what distance from the sea did you leave this turtle?" asked the engineer, who, having suspended his work, was reflecting on the incident. 15 feet at the most." "And the tide was low at the time?" "Yes, Captain." "Well," replied the engineer, "what the turtle could not do on the sand, it might have been able to do in the water. It turned over when the tide overtook it, and then quietly returned to the deep sea." "Oh, what stupids we were!" cried Neb. "That is precisely what I had the honor of telling you before," returned the sailor. Cyrus Harding had given his explanation, which no doubt was admissible, but was he himself convinced of the accuracy of the explanation? It cannot be said that he was. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. On the 9th of October, the bark canoe was entirely finished. Pencroft had kept his promise, and a light boat, the shell of which was joined together by the flexible twigs of the caraimba, had been constructed in 5 days. A seat in the stern, a second seat in the middle to preserve the equilibrium, a third seat in the bows, rowlocks for the 2 oars, a scull to steer with, completed the little craft, which was 12 feet long and did not weigh more than 200 pounds. The operation of launching it was extremely simple. The canoe was carried to the beach and laid on the sand before Granite House, and the rising tide floated it. Pencroft, who leaped in directly, maneuvered it with the scull and declared it to be just the thing for the purpose to which they wished to put it. "Hurrah!" cried the sailor, who did not disdain to celebrate thus his own triumph. "With this, we could go round." "The world?" asked Gideon Spilett. "No, the island. Some stones for ballast, a mast and a sail, which the captain will make for us some day, and we shall go splendidly." "Well, Captain, and you, Mr. Spilett, and you, Herbert, and you, Neb, aren't you coming to try our new vessel? Come along, we must see if it will carry all 5 of us." This was certainly a trial which ought to be made. Pencroft soon brought the canoe to the shore by a narrow passage among the rocks, and it was agreed that they should make a trial of the boat that day by following the shore as far as the first point at which the rocks in the south ended. As they embarked, Neb cried, "But your boat leaks rather, Pencroft." "That's nothing," said Neb, replied the sailor. "The wood will get seasoned. In 2 days there won't be a single leak, and our boat will have no more water in her than there is in the stomach of a drunkard. Jump in!" They were soon all seated, and Pencroft shoved off. The weather was magnificent, the sea as calm as if its waters were contained within the narrow limits of a lake. Thus the boat could proceed with as much security as if it was ascending the tranquil current of the Mersey. Neb took one of the oars, Herbert the other, and Pencroft remained in the stern in order to use the scull. The sailor first crossed the channel and steered close to the southern point of the islet. A light breeze blew from the south. No roughness was found either in the channel or the green sea. A long swell, which the canoe scarcely felt, as if it was heavily laden, rolled regularly over the surface of the water. They pulled out about half a mile distant from the shore, that they might have a good view of Mount Franklin. Pencroft afterwards returned towards the mouth of the river. The boat then skirted the shore, which, extending to the extreme point, hid all Tadorn's ferns. This point, of which the distance was increased by the irregularity of the coast, was nearly 3 miles from the Mersey. The settlers resolved to go to its extremity and only go beyond it as much as was necessary to take a rapid survey of the coast as far as Claw Cape. The canoe followed the windings of the shore, avoiding the rocks which fringed it, and which the rising tide began to cover. The cliff gradually sloped away from the mouth of the river to the point. This was formed of granite rocks, capriciously distributed, very different from the cliff at Prospect Heights, and of an extremely wild aspect. It might have been said that an immense cartload of rocks had been emptied out there. There was no vegetation on this sharp promontory, which projected 2 miles from the forest, and it thus represented a giant's arm stretched out from a leafy sleeve. The canoe, impelled by the 2 oars, advanced without difficulty. Gideon Spilett, pencil in one hand and notebook in the other, sketched the coast in bold strokes. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroft chatted, while examining this part of their domain, which was new to them, and in proportion as the canoe proceeded towards the south, the 2 mandible capes appeared to move and surrounded Union Bay more closely. As to Cyrus Harding, he did not speak. He simply gazed, and by the mistrust which his look expressed, it appeared that he was examining some strange country. In the meantime, after a voyage of 3/4 of an hour, the canoe reached the extremity of the point, and Pencroft was prepared to return when Herbert, rising, pointed to a black object, saying, "What do I see down there on the beach?" All eyes turned towards the point indicated. "Why," said the reporter, "there is something. It looks like part of a wreck half buried in the sand." "Ah," cried Pencroft, "I see what it is." "What?" asked Neb. Barrels, which perhaps are full," replied the sailor. "Pull to the shore, Pencroft," said Cyrus. A few strokes of the oar brought the canoes into a little creek, and its passengers leaped on shore. Pencroft was not mistaken. 2 barrels were there, half buried in the sand, but still firmly attached to a large chest, which, sustained by them, had floated to the moment when it stranded on the beach. "There's been a wreck, then, in some part of the island?" said Herbert. "Evidently," replied Spilett. "But what's in this chest?" cried Pencroft with very natural impatience. "What's in this chest? It's shut up, and nothing to open it with." "Well, perhaps a stone." And the sailor, raising a heavy block, was about to break in one of the sides of the chest when the engineer arrested his hand. "Pencroft," said he, "can you restrain your impatience for 1 hour only?" "But, Captain, just think. Perhaps there's everything we want in there." "We shall find that out, Pencroft," replied the engineer. "But trust to me, and do not break the chest, which may be useful to us. We must convey it to Granite House, where we can open it easily and without breaking it. It is quite prepared for a voyage, and since it has floated here, it may just as well float to the mouth of the river." "You're right, Captain, and I was wrong, as usual," replied the sailor. The engineer's advice was good. In fact, the canoe probably would not have been able to contain the articles possibly enclosed in the chest, which doubtless was heavy, since 2 empty barrels were required to buoy it up. It was therefore much better to tow it to the beach at Granite House. And now, where had this chest come? That was the important question. Cyrus Harding and his companions looked attentively around them and examined the shore for several hundred steps. No other articles or pieces of wreck could be found. Herbert and Neb climbed a high rock to the survey of his sea. But there was nothing in sight, neither a dismasted vessel nor a ship under sail. However, there was no doubt that there had been a wreck. Perhaps this incident was connected with that of the bullet. Perhaps strangers had landed on another part of the island. Perhaps they were still there. But he thought which came naturally the thought which came naturally to the settlers was that these strangers could not be Malay princes, for the chest was evidently of American or European make. All the party returned to the chest, which was of an unusually large size. It was made of oak wood, very carefully closed and covered with a thick hide, which was secured by copper nails. The 2 great barrels, hermetically sealed, but which sounded hollow and empty, were fastened to its sides by strong ropes, knotted with a skill which Pencroft directly pronounced sailors alone could exhibit. It appeared to be in the perfect state of preservation, which was explained by the fact that it had stranded on a sandy beach and not among rocks. They had no doubt whatever, on examining it carefully, that it had been long in the making. "We will keep it for ourselves," cried Pencroft, "but what in the world can there be in it?" The sea was already approaching the chest, and the high tide would probably float it. One of the ropes which fastened the barrels was partly unlashed and used as a cable to unite the floating apparatus with the canoe. Pencroft and Neb then dug away the sand with their oars so as to facilitate the moving of the chest, towing which the boat soon began to double the point, to which the name of Flotsam Point was given. The chest was heavy, and the barrels were scarcely sufficient to keep it above water. The sailor also feared every instant that it would get loose and sink to the bottom of the sea. But happily his fears were not realized, and for an hour and a half after they set out, all the time necessary. All that time had been taken up in going a distance of 3 miles. The boat touched the beach below Granite House. Canoe and chest were then hauled up on the sands, and as the tide was then going out, they were soon left high and dry. Neb, hurrying home, brought back some tools with which to open the crack in such a way that it might be injured as little as possible, and they proceeded to its inventory. Pencroft did not try to hide that which he greatly expected. Screwed up that sentence. Pencroft did not try to hide that he was greatly excited. The sailor began by detaching the 2 barrels, which, being in good condition, would of course be free. The sailor began by detaching the 2 barrels, which, being in good condition, would of course be of use. Then the locks were forced with a cold chisel and hammer, and the lid thrown back. A second casing of zinc lined the interior of the chest, which had been evidently arranged that the articles which it enclosed might under any circumstances be sheltered from damp. "Oh," cried Neb, "suppose it's jam." "I hope not," replied the reporter. "If only there was," said the sailor in a low voice. "What?" asked Neb, who overheard him. "Nothing." The covering of zinc was torn off and thrown back over the sides of the chest, and by degrees numerous articles of very varied character were produced and strewed about on the sand. At each new object Pencroft uttered fresh hurrahs. Herbert clapped his hands, and Neb danced up and down. There were books which made Herbert wild with joy, and cooking utensils which Neb covered with kisses. In short, the colonists had reasons to be extremely satisfied, for this chest contained tools, weapons, instruments, clothes. In short, the colonists had reason to be extremely satisfied, for this chest contained tools, weapons, instruments, clothes, books, and this is the exact list of them as stated in Gideon Spilett's notebook. Tools: 3 knives with several blades, 2 woodsman's axes, 2 carpenter's hatchets, 3 planes, 2 adzes, 1 twibell or mattock, 6 chisels, 2 files, 3 hammers, 3 gimlets, 2 augers, 10 bags of nails and screws, 3 saws of different sizes, 2 boxes of needles. Weapons: 2 flintlock guns, 2 for percussion caps, 2 beach loader carbines, 5 boarding cutlasses, 4 sabers, 2 barrels of powder, each containing 25 pounds, 12 boxes of percussion caps. Instruments: 1 sextant, 1 double opera glass, a telescope, 1 box of mathematical instruments, 1 mariner's compass, 1 Fahrenheit thermometer, 1 aneroid barometer, 1 box containing a photographic apparatus, object plates, glass, chemicals, etc. Clothes: 2 dozen shirts of a peculiar material resembling wool, but evidently of a vegetable origin, 3 dozen stockings of the same material. Utensils: 1 iron pot, 6 copper saucepans, 3 iron dishes, 10 metal plates, 2 kettles, 1 portable stove, 6 table knives. Books: 1 Bible, 1 atlas, 1 dictionary of the different Polynesian idioms, 1 dictionary of natural science in 6 volumes, 3 reams of white paper, 2 books with blank pages. "It must be allowed," said the reporter after the inventory had been made. Let's try that again. "It must be allowed," said the reporter after the inventory had been made, "that the owner of this chest was a practical man. Tools, weapons, instruments, clothes, utensils, books, nothing is wanting. It might really be said that he expected to be wrecked and had prepared for it beforehand." "Nothing is wanted indeed," murmured Cyrus Harding thoughtfully. "And for a certainty," added Herbert, "the vessel which carried this chest and its owner was not a Malay pirate." "Unless," said Pencroft, "the owner had been taken prisoner by pirates." "That is not admissible," replied the reporter. It is more probable that an American or European vessel has been driven into this quarter and that her passengers, wishing to save necessities until the least, prepared this chest and threw it overboard. Is that your opinion, Captain? Asked Herbert. Yes, my boy, replied the engineer. That may have been the case. It is possible that at the moment, or in expectation of a wreck, they collected into this chest different articles of the greatest use in hopes of finding it again on the coast. Even the photographic box, exclaimed the sailor incredulously. As to that apparatus, replied Harding, I do not quite see the use of it, and a more complete supply of clothes or more abundant ammunition would have been more valuable to us as well as to any other castaways. But isn't there any mark or direction of these instruments, tools or books, which would tell us something about them? Asked Gideon Spilett. That might be ascertained. Each article was carefully examined, especially the books, instruments, and weapons. Neither the weapons nor the instruments, contrary to the usual custom, bore the name of the maker. They were, besides, in a perfect state, and did not appear to have been used. The same peculiarity marked the tools and utensils. All were new, which proved that the articles had not been taken by chance and thrown into the chest, but, on the contrary, that the choice of things had been well considered and arranged with care. This was also indicated by the second case of metal which had preserved them from damp, and which could not have been soldered in a moment of haste. As to the dictionaries of natural science and Polynesian idioms, both were English, but they neither bore the name of the publisher nor the date of publication. The same with the Bible printed in English, in quarto, remarkable from a typographic point of view, and which appeared to have been very often used. The atlas was a magnificent work comprising maps of every country in the world and several planispheres arranged upon Mercator's projection. Besides, there was nothing, therefore, on the different articles by which they could be traced, and nothing consequently of a nature to show the nationality of the vessel, which must have recently passed these shores. But wherever the chest might have come from, it was a treasure to the settlers on Lincoln Island. Till then, by making use of the productions of nature, they had created everything for themselves, and thanks to their intelligence, they had managed without difficulty. But did it not appear as if Providence had wished to reward them by sending them these productions of human industry? Their thanks rose unanimously to heaven. However, one of them was not quite satisfied. It was Pencroft. It appeared that the chest did not contain something which he evidently held in great esteem, for in proportion as they approached the bottom of the box, his hurrahs diminished in wariness, in heartiness, and the inventory finished, he was heard to mutter these words, "That's all very fine, but you can see that there's nothing for me in that box." This led Neb to say, "Why, Pencroft, what more do you expect?" "Half a pound of tobacco," replied Pencroft seriously, "and nothing would have been wanting to complete my happiness." But the result of this discovery of the chest was that it was now more than ever necessary to explore the island thoroughly. It was therefore agreed that the next morning at break of day they should get out, ascended by the Mercy, so as to reach the western shore. If any castaways had landed on the coast, it was to be feared they were without resources, and it was therefore the more necessary to carry help to them without delay. During the day, the different articles were carried to Granite House, where they were methodically arranged in the great hall. This day, the 29th of October, appeared to be a bad day. Herbert asked the engineer if he would not read them something from the Gospel. "Willingly," replied Cyrus Harding. He took the sacred volume, and was about to open it, when Pencroft stopped him, saying, "Captain, I'm superstitious. Open at random and read the first verse which your eye falls upon. We will see if it applies to our situation." Cyrus Harding smiled at the sailor's idea, and yielding to his wish, he opened exactly at a place where the leaves were separated by a marker. Immediately his eyes were attracted by a cross which, made with a pencil, was placed against the 8th verse of the 7th chapter of the Gospel of St. Matthew. He read the verse, which was this: For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth. End of chapter 2. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.